book is not a unified divine document, but a compilation of older sources, assembled by human editors generations after the events they describe, resulting in a text that is, as he put it, fragmented, inconsistent, and mutilated by the process of its own transmission. His community issued the most severe excommunication in their recorded history. He spent the rest of his life writing anyway. We are going to do exactly what he did, starting on page 1, because here is what you find on the very first page. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are not the same story, not two perspectives on the same events, not a poetic account followed by a literal one. Two accounts that contradict each other on fundamental, verifiable, checkable facts. In Genesis 1, the sequence is precise: light, sky, dry land, then vegetation, plants and trees, then the sun, moon, and stars, then sea creatures and birds, then land animals, and finally, as the crowning achievement of all creation, humanity. Male and female created simultaneously. Male and female, he created them.
Come on, you dick sucker.
One event. One moment. End of day 6. Turn the page to Genesis 2. The entire sequence resets.
Damn it.
In Genesis 2, a God forms a man from dust before any vegetation exists. The text is explicit. It hadn't rained yet. There was no one to till the ground. The man exists before the plants. God then plants a garden. Then, observing the man's solitude, God forms the animals and brings them one by one to be named. When none proves a suitable companion, after the entire animal kingdom has been paraded past and found wanting, God puts the man to sleep, removes a rib, and builds the woman. Last, after everything else, Genesis 1, plants before humans.
Man, you dumbass, you still
humans before plants. Genesis 1, animals before humans. Genesis 2, animals after the man before the woman. Genesis 1, man and woman created simultaneously. Genesis 2, 3 separate events divided by an indeterminate span of time. Both cannot describe the same creation. And there is no interpretive framework, none, that reconciles these sequences without dismantling the plain meaning of the text. This is not a spiritual paradox. It is a textual impossibility in the opening pages of the most widely distributed book in human history. And the contradictions go deeper than sequence. The two accounts name God differently. In Genesis 1, the Creator is Elohim, transcendent, impersonal, almost architectural. He doesn't touch anything. He speaks, and reality obeys. Let there be light. No emotion, no physical presence, pure command. In Genesis 2, the Creator is Yahweh Elohim. He kneels in the dirt. He shapes clay with his hands. He performs surgery. He walks in the garden, in the cool of the evening, which means he has a body that registers temperature. And then, this is the detail that changes everything once you notice it. He calls out through the trees to the man who is hiding. Where are you? The omniscient creator of the universe doesn't know where someone is. He has to ask. Two different names, two different characters, two mutually exclusive cosmologies,
God damn it,
sitting back to back in the same book, separated by a paragraph break.
Damn it.
Now, who put them there? And why would anyone look at two mutually exclusive accounts and decide to keep both?
Damn it.
That question has a precise answer. But to reach it, we need to go somewhere that institutional religion has spent centuries trying to keep you away from. The academic framework that explains this is called the documentary hypothesis, formalized by Julius Wellhausen in 1878. It is the foundational framework of professional biblical scholarship. It is taught at Harvard Divinity School, in Catholic seminaries across Europe, in mainstream Protestant theological institutions worldwide. The first account, Genesis 1 through the opening of chapter 2, was written by a community of priests during the Babylonian exile, roughly the 6th century BCE. Scholars call it the priestly source, or P-formal, structured, organized around the sanctity of the Sabbath. The second account, beginning at Genesis 2:4, comes from a much older tradition, likely from the southern kingdom of Judah centuries earlier. Scholars call it the Yahwist source, or J. Warner, more narrative, more human in its portrayal of God. It reads like what it is, ancient folklore. Centuries after both were written, an editor stitched them together. He didn't resolve the contradictions. He didn't choose one over the other. He placed both accounts side by side and left the scenes visible on the page. Spinoza saw those scenes in 1670, 2 centuries before Wellhausen named the framework. What he observed was that the Pentateuch bore all the marks of the text, assembled by human hands from multiple older sources, edited together without care to resolve the inconsistencies between them. He argued that this kind of compilation, multiple voices, multiple eras, stitched imperfectly into a single document, was not the signature of divine authorship. It was the signature of an editorial committee working under historical pressure, selecting from what they had. The documentary hypothesis gave that observation a formal name. The observation itself was Spinoza's. You, the scholars, know this. They teach it to each other in graduate seminars and academic conferences, and the footnotes of books their congregants will never read. And then they stand in front of their congregations on Sunday and say nothing. Not one word. And when you apply that method to the next question, where did these source documents come from? What were the priestly writers drawing on when they described the origin of the universe? You arrive at the single most devastating archaeological discovery for biblical literalism in modern history. In 1849, a man named Hormuzd Rassam was excavating the royal library of Ashurbanipal in the ruins of ancient Nineveh, in what is now northern Iraq. The library had been buried under desert sand for over 2,000 years. Among the tens of thousands of clay tablets recovered from that rubble, scholars found a creation epic that would permanently reframe how historians understand the Bible. It predated the earliest Hebrew writing by at least 1,000 years. It described the origin of the universe in a sequence that, by now, should sound very familiar. The epic is called the Enuma Elish. In the Enuma Elish, the universe begins as dark, formless, watery chaos. The god Marduk slays the great ocean goddess Tiamat and splits her body in two. From one half, he creates the dome of the sky to hold back the cosmic waters above. From the other half, he forms the earth below. He sets the sun, moon, and stars in the firmament. He creates human beings from clay and divine blood to relieve the gods of labor. Then the gods rest. Now read Genesis 1. So the universe begins as a formless void, darkness over the face of the deep. The Hebrew word for the deep is Tehom. Linguists have documented for over a century that Tehom and Tiamat share the same Semitic root, the same ancient word for the primordial ocean. The Spirit of God moves over the waters. God divides the waters from the waters, creating a firmament, a solid dome, to hold back the cosmic ocean above and form the earth below. He sets the luminaries in the firmament. He creates humanity from dust. Then God rests. Same sequence. Same cosmological architecture. Vocabulary sharing documented linguistic roots across 2 languages and several centuries. In 1872, a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith was translating cuneiform tablets at the British Museum when he found something that stopped him cold. Among the tablets recovered from Nineveh was an account of a great flood. A flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. Survived by a single righteous man who built a boat, loaded it with animals, and sent out birds to find dry land. Smith was so shaken by what he read that witnesses reported him standing up, pacing the room, and beginning to undress in a state of agitation before regaining composure. He had just read the flood story.
Jesus goddamn fucking goddamn.
Tehom and Tiamat share the same Semitic root, the same ancient word for the primordial ocean. The Spirit of God moves over the waters. God divides the waters from the waters, creating a firmament, a solid dome, to hold back the cosmic ocean above and form the earth below. He sets the luminaries in the firmament. He creates humanity from dust. Then God rests. Same sequence, same cosmological architecture. Vocabulary sharing documented linguistic roots across two languages in several centuries. In 1872, a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith was translating cuneiform tablets at the British Museum when he found something that stopped him cold. Among the tablets recovered from Nineveh was an account of a great flood, a flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, survived by a single righteous man who built a boat, loaded it with animals, and sent out birds to find dry land. Smith was so shaken by what he read that witnesses reported him standing up, pacing the room, and beginning to undress in a state of... Just named George Smith was translating cuneiform tablets at the British Museum when he found something that stopped him cold. Among the tablets recovered from Nineveh was an account of a great flood, a flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, survived by a single righteous man who built a boat, loaded it with animals, and sent out birds to find dry land. Smith was so shaken by what he read that witnesses reported him standing up, pacing the room, and beginning to undress in a state of agitation before regaining composure. He had just read the flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh, written centuries before Genesis, with the same boat, the same animal, the same birds, the same mountain, the same rainbow-equivalent covenant at the end. When Smith announced his discovery publicly in London, it caused a sensation. The Times of London covered it. And the public understood immediately what scholars have been careful to discuss only in academic language ever since. The biblical narratives were not unique revelations. They were part of a broader literary tradition of the ancient Near East, drawing from the same mythological reservoir as the cultures that surrounded Israel. The Israelites were not in Ohio when they wrote Genesis 1. They were in Babylon, literally in Babylon, the capital of the empire that had destroyed their temple, demolished their state, and marched their intellectual class into captivity in 586 BCE. Every year, at the New Year festival, the Babylonians recited the Enuma Elish publicly. Every year, the exiled Israelite priests heard the story of Marduk and Tiamat and the divided cosmic ocean. And then they sat down and wrote a counter-narrative. And they took the cosmological framework of their captors and dismantled its theology from the inside. In the Babylonian version, creation is a byproduct of divine violence, the universe made from a corpse. In Genesis 1, creation is peaceful, intentional, declared good. In the Babylonian version, humanity is a servant class created to relieve the gods of labor. In Genesis 1, humanity is the apex and purpose of everything that preceded it. In the Babylonian version, there are competing divine forces with incompatible agendas. In Genesis 1, there is one God, one will, one uninterrupted act of purposeful creation. It is a brilliant act of theological resistance by a conquered people. You can admire it completely and still follow the implication to where it lands. This is a document written by identifiable people in a specific historical crisis for specific political purposes from identifiable borrowed sources. It is not divine revelation. It is resistance literature. And if Genesis is resistance literature, if the text is human, then the next question is the one the institution most fears. What exactly did they build on top of it? Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. If you grew up in any tradition shaped by Christianity, you've heard this verse invoked constantly. The Imago Dei, the foundation of human dignity, the origin of the soul, depending on the tradition, free will, an immortal soul, the capacity for moral reason, some carefully undefined spiritual quality that elevates humanity above the animal kingdom. What they did not tell you is what that phrase meant in the world where it was written. You're in the ancient Near East. Image of God was not a spiritual concept. It was a political title, a legal designation of power, authority, and the exclusive right to rule. And it belonged to exactly one person per civilization. In Egypt, the Pharaoh was the image of God on earth, his physical representative, authorized to exercise divine authority over every person and territory within the empire. In Mesopotamia, the Babylonian king held the identical title for the identical reason. The image of God was the ideological foundation of absolute monarchy. It made the king's commands divine commands, his wars holy wars, submission to him cosmically mandatory. One person per empire, every other human being a subject. When the exiled Israelite priests wrote Genesis 1, they were writing inside a culture where this phrase carried an immediate, unambiguous, politically explosive meaning. Every Babylonian who heard it knew what it meant. Every Israelite who had grown up under occupation knew what it meant. And the priestly writers took that title, the exclusive property of kings and emperors, and assigned it to every human being on earth without exception. Every person, male and female, conquered and conqueror, exile and king, all of them, image of God. This was not a spiritual affirmation. This was sedition, a direct theological assault on Babylonian imperial ideology, written in the precise language that ideology used to justify itself. It declared, the title your king uses to claim divine authority over everyone else belongs to every human being who has ever lived. No king holds an exclusive claim. And no priest, no empire, no institution.
Come on, you bitch.
One of the most radical egalitarian statements in the history of ancient literature. And then, the institution did what institutions always do with radical egalitarian statements. It neutralized them. The vehicle for that neutralization was Greek philosophy. When Christianity expanded into the Hellenistic world, it absorbed a framework that the original Hebrew authors of Genesis never held. The Platonic division between soul and body, where the immaterial soul is the true self, and the physical body is corrupt matter, dragging it downward. This framework, foreign to the Hebrew Bible entirely, became the lens through which the later church read every sacred text it inherited. Through that lens, did the Imago Dei stop being a political declaration about human dignity and became a metaphysical claim about an invisible soul. And once it was an invisible soul, it could be diagnosed, evaluated, found deficient, found fallen. The later church stripped this act of radical political theology of every ounce of its political content, locked it inside that Platonic soul, and announced that this soul was diseased, corrupted at the source, born broken, in need of institutional repair. The Imago Dei, the declaration that dismantled the divine right of kings, became the baseline from which the inevitable corruption is measured. You are made in God's image, but that image is stained. You are created in God's likeness, but that likeness has fallen.
From
You need the sacraments. You need the mediation. You need the institution standing between you and the God whose image you supposedly bear. How does a sentence written to demolish the ideological foundation of absolute monarchy become the cornerstone of institutional control over individual human beings? One word. In Hebrew, traveling through 3 languages across 8 centuries, landed in a specific theological battle in North Africa in the 4th century, where a man named Augustine was fighting for his institutional life. Here is exactly what happened. Open Genesis 3. A man and a woman are told not to eat from a specific tree. A serpent, not Satan, not a fallen angel, simply a serpent described as shrewd, persuades the woman to eat the fruit. She gives some to the man.
You suck, my
God discovers what happened and issues consequences. Pain in childbirth, difficulty farming, mortality, and expulsion from the garden. Read that passage as carefully as you wish. The word sin does not appear in the chapter. The concept of inherited guilt does not appear. The condemnation of all future humanity does not appear. The word fall, as in the fall of man, does not appear anywhere in Genesis. The Jewish tradition which produced this text has never held the doctrine of original sin. Judaism reads the same passage and arrives at a fundamentally different conclusion about human nature. The rabbis do not teach inherited corruption. The text does not teach it. So where did original sin come from? Watch this sequence precisely. The story begins in Hebrew. The serpent is called Aram. Shrewd, deceptive, aware. When the woman eats the fruit, the text says her eyes were opened. And not that she transmitted biological corruption to her descendants. Her eyes were opened. The Hebrew narrative is about the acquisition of self-consciousness, moral discernment, the burden of awareness, the cost of becoming fully human. The Jewish interpretive tradition has understood it this way for centuries. 300 years later, the Septuagint translates the Hebrew into Greek. The story shifts in texture as it moves between languages. Words carry different weights in different tongues. Then Paul writes in Greek, 1st century CE. His letter to the Romans, chapter 5, verse 12, contains a phrase that is grammatically ambiguous. It can mean, because all sinned. Individual responsibility, each person accountable for their own choices. The Greek syntax supports this reading directly. 400 years after Paul, Jerome translates the Greek into Latin. His Vulgate renders that ambiguous phrase in a way that Augustine of Hippo reads as, in whom all sinned, all of humanity sinning corporately, inside Adam at the moment of his act. But Augustine wasn't just making a translation error in isolation, he was fighting a war. His opponent was a British monk named Pelagius, who had arrived in Rome around 400 CE teaching something straightforward and, to Augustine, catastrophically dangerous. That human beings are born free of inherited guilt. That sin is a matter of individual choice. And that salvation is therefore achievable through human effort and moral will. Pelagius had a large following. His theology was coherent, and it left no room for the institutional church as a necessary intermediary between the individual and God. And Augustine understood the stakes immediately. If Pelagius was right, if humans are born innocent and sin by choice, then the institutional apparatus of sacramental mediation is optional at best. You don't need a priest to remove inherited corruption if there is no inherited corruption. You don't need the church's medicine if you were never born sick. So Augustine built the architecture of original sin not only from a mistranslation, but as a deliberate weapon in a battle for institutional survival. The corruption inherited from Adam wasn't just a theological position. It was the foundation on which the necessity of the institutional church rested. Destroy Pelagius, and you guarantee that every human being who has ever lived needs what only the church can provide. The Council of Carthage condemned Pelagianism in 418 CE. Augustine and the doctrine he constructed to win that battle built on a Latin mistranslation of an ambiguous Greek phrase in a letter written 3 centuries after the events it describes, deployed as institutional ammunition against a theological rival, became the foundation of Western Christianity's understanding of human nature for the next 1,500 years. Your nature corrupted before you were born. Punishment before you have made a single choice. The disease present in your bloodstream from your first breath. One story. Hebrew to Greek to Latin to a political battle in North Africa to a theological system that shaped an entire civilization.
Motherfucking dick.
At every step, human hands, human choices, human power struggles, nothing more. And this is precisely what Spinoza meant when he argued that Scripture must be read as a natural document, a product of specific human authors, writing in specific historical circumstances with specific political motives. Not eternal revealed truth descending from above. Literature produced below. When you read it that way, the only way that is actually
I'm getting in your business!
The machinery behind the guilt becomes visible.
I'm getting in your
business. And once visible, it loses the power it had when you thought it was speaking directly to you across time. I want to stop here and say something directly. If you have ever lain awake at night, carrying a sense of being fundamentally wrong, not for anything you have done, but for what you are, for your nature, for the fact of your existence, that feeling has a precise historical address. It was not revealed to you, and it was installed by a theological architecture built on a mistranslation, a Greek phrase in a 1st century letter, misread by a 4th century bishop fighting a political battle, encoded in the Latin Bible, transmitted across 1,500 years by institutions that had every structural reason to keep you feeling exactly that way. The guilt is real. It does genuine damage. It costs real years of real lives. But the diagnosis is a construction. It has an author. It has a date. It has a political motive. And once you can trace it back to a council chamber in Carthage in 418 CE, and a bishop who needed you to be born broken in order to need what he was building, it stops feeling like revelation. It starts feeling like what it is. Someone else's power grab that you have been paying for your entire life. You did not deserve that, but no one does. And then the science arrives, and it does not negotiate. There was no Adam. There was no Eve. Not as historical individuals from whom all humanity descends. Population genetics has settled this question. The human species has never passed through a bottleneck of 2 individuals. Not 2, not 10, not 100. The minimum ancestral population of Homo sapiens, the smallest we ever got, during any bottleneck the genetic record can detect, was approximately 10,000 individuals. Some estimates place it considerably higher. None approach 2. 2 individuals cannot produce the genetic diversity observed in the human population today. The mathematics do not permit it. The genomic record does not support it. And this conclusion doesn't rest on a single line of evidence. And it comes from multiple independent sources converging on the same answer. The mitochondrial DNA record, which traces lineage through the maternal line, places the origin of modern human populations in sub-Saharan Africa approximately 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, and requires a founding population in the thousands, not two. The Y chromosome record, tracing paternal lineage independently, arrives at the same conclusion through a completely separate genetic pathway. The research of Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza, who spent decades mapping human genetic diversity across populations worldwide, established that the patterns of variation in the human genome are consistent only with the species that evolved as a large, geographically distributed population over hundreds of thousands of years. 3 independent lines of genetic evidence, through 3 different methodologies, the same answer. Not a garden in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago, a population, a continent, a time frame that renders the entire Genesis chronology a historical footnote. In 1950, Pope Pius XII issued an encyclical called Humani Generis. It formally permitted Catholics to accept the evolution of the human body from earlier primate ancestors, a concession that appeared significant at the time. Read the fine print. In the same document, Pius XII declared Catholics absolutely forbidden from accepting polygenism, the scientific reality that humanity evolved as a population rather than descending from a single couple. The faithful must believe in one literal historical Adam and one literal historical Eve. The genetic evidence makes this impossible, not improbable, not theologically inconvenient, unphysically, mathematically impossible. So why hold that specific line? Why concede the body to biology and refuse to concede the founding pair? Because the pair is not a theological detail, it is a load-bearing wall. Remove the literal Adam and Eve, and there is no literal fall. Without the literal fall, there is no inherited corruption. Without inherited corruption, the diagnosis disappears. And without the diagnosis, the original sin that contaminates every human being from the moment of birth. The institution that holds the exclusive license for the cure loses the problem it was constructed to solve. The sacraments, the absolution, the clerical mediation, the monopoly on salvation. Every element of the institutional architecture depends on the disease being real. They will concede the body. They will not concede the founding pair. But because guilt is the most profitable product ever constructed, and they built an empire on yours. If you are not sick, you do not need their medicine. If you were not born broken, you do not need their sacraments. If there was no fall, there is nothing for the institution to save you from. This is not speculation. This is the logical structure of the argument, visible to anyone who follows it, without first asking institutional permission. Here is what the real origin of humanity looks like. You are not the product of a single act of divine sculpture 6,000 years ago. You are the current expression of an unbroken chain of survival, stretching back across 300,000 years of Homo sapiens. Not 2 people, but a population. Thousands of individuals who lived, struggled, and passed life forward. Before them, our earlier hominid ancestors. Before them, the common primate ancestors shared with every living great ape.
You suck my motherfucking dick.
Before that, the mammals who survived the extinction that ended the Cretaceous. Back through the first vertebrates, the first multicellular organisms, all the way to single-celled life in an ancient ocean 4 billion years ago. You are not a fallen creature petitioning an angry king for restoration to a grace you lost before you existed. You are a temporary, conscious, extraordinarily improbable arrangement of matter that the universe produced across 4 billion years of chemistry and biology, complex enough to turn back and ask how it got here. That is not a smaller story than Genesis. It is incomparably larger by every measure. More ancient, more intricate, more genuinely astonishing than any six-day narrative assembled by exiled priests to counter Babylonian propaganda. Spinoza said that whatever we understand about the natural world, we understand about God. He meant it without metaphor. The rational order of the universe, the laws of physics, the logic of natural selection, the mathematics underlying the structure of matter. This was for him the only conception of God that survived honest examination. Not a cosmic monarch issuing commands from above a solid dome. Not a being with preferences and a temper, and a biography riddled with contradictions. The infinite, rational, unbreakable order of things. Deus sive natura. God or nature. The same thing. To study that order without asking an institution for permission, that was, for Spinoza, the only genuine form of reverence. And the universe held up under question. The institution did not. You were taught that doubt was the enemy, that the discomfort you felt when the sequences contradicted each other, when the timeline made no sense, when the God in the text behaved in ways no decent human being would be permitted to behave. That discomfort was a spiritual failure. It was not. Your doubt was your intelligence operating correctly. The part of you that noticed the sequences didn't align. The numbers didn't work. The guilt had no proportionate cause. The institutions constructed systems, social, psychological, financial, specifically designed to make that noticing feel like transgression. Because it is transgression. Against the institution. Not against the truth. What has been described here today is not hidden. And the two incompatible creation accounts are in every serious seminary curriculum. The relationship between the Enuma Elish and Genesis 1 has been in the academic literature for 150 years. The documentary hypothesis is the standard framework of professional biblical scholarship. The impossibility of a two-person human founding population is settled genetics. Scholars have been systematically dismantling Augustine's construction for decades, including scholars writing from within the tradition itself. This information is in the libraries. It is in the peer-reviewed journals. It is taught in the graduate programs that produce the people who will stand in pulpits and say nothing. The institution is not suppressing this because it is uncertain, and it is suppressing it because this information is structurally incompatible with the continued operation of the institution as currently built. A congregation that understands the documentary hypothesis, the Babylonian origins of Genesis, the genetic impossibility of Adam and Eve, and the precise historical and political construction of original sin is a congregation that no longer requires clerical mediation between itself and whatever it means by God. That is not a congregation. That is people thinking, which is all Spinoza ever asked for. Read the text honestly. Follow the evidence without asking permission. Treat Scripture the way a scientist treats nature, as something to be understood, not obeyed. The institution that destroyed him for saying so is still standing. But the method he described is the method every honest scholar uses today, whether they say his name or not. You do not have to carry this anymore. The garden is not a historical location. The rib is not a historical event. The inherited corruption diagnosed in your nature before you were born is not a medical fact. It is a construction, documented, dated, traceable to a specific mistranslation, a specific political battle, a specific man in North Africa who needed you to be born broken in order to need what he was building. The chains were made of language, and language, once read clearly, loses its hold. If this video names something you have been carrying without words, do not keep it to yourself. Someone in your life is awake right now, feeling broken by nature, too afraid to say it. They deserve to know where it came from. And send them this. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. How many countries? How many different traditions? How many of us were handed the same story about our origins on opposite sides of the world and told it was the unquestionable word of God? And if you want to leave one more thing, if the guilt you were taught to feel about your own existence was built on a human error, compounded across 1,500 years, across 3 languages, deployed as a weapon in a political battle you were never told about, does that change what you owe the institution that taught it to you? Leave that in the comments. I'll be reading. The only question left is whether you're willing to look.
A fucking goddamn fucking cunt, Christ. Fucking Christ. Fucking Christ. Fucking goddamn Christ. Christ, goddamn.
The concept of an afterlife, the very idea of what comes next, where are we going and why, what does it mean about why we're here in the first place, these are foundational elements to any religious belief system. And of course today we're talking about Christianity and the evolution of the afterlife, biblically speaking, and it has changed quite a bit. In fact, it's even continuing to change. But if a perfect omniscient God wanted to communicate, supposedly like he did, the ideas about this afterlife, from his own mouth, from the mouth of his Son, and from the mouth of his foremost prophets, we should be able to expect that it would be consistent no matter who is saying it or how they have described it. But that's not what we see. We see different parts of the Bible written at different times with different cultural and political and religious motivations and pressures that represent this afterlife differently because of those things. If you can't be certain about your salvation, about where you go when you die, or when it happens, or how it happens, or what it's going to be like, what can you trust from this book? You can't then turn around and say, oh, but I know for certain that saved me can't lose my salvation. Oh, but I know for certain what objective morality is. Oh, but I know for certain what it means to love and worship and obey God. No, some things can be mysteries. Sometimes God's ways can be higher, but there's too much information said in this collection of books that we call the Bible about the afterlife to just let it off the hook for this obvious man-made change over time. And so how did we come to talk about this today? Really quick, I want to plug something brand new on the channel.
Move your whore!
For anyone that is in the free thinker tier, which is $10 and above per month on Patreon. Once a month you go into a drawing if you have raised your hand to pick any topic that you want me to do a video on. So I put it out there to everyone in the category and above for the month of February, and I know people aren't used to me communicating on the Patreon, so please start checking that now. 17 of you raised your hand for February, and I did a random generator through Excel, and Becca, you only won. Becca actually happens to have her own channel, Faith Exposed, which let's go give her some love, check it out, subscribe if it's going to be right for you. She also has this great interview on Harmonic Atheist if you want to learn more about her. She gave me a handful of ideas to pick from, and one of them was the evolution of the afterlife, biblically speaking, and I was very excited to do it. So thank you, Becca. Thank you, everyone, for the support in any category, even if you're not a free thinker. It all matters, it all helps, and if you want to contribute, the link is down below. So what are we going to do for this video? We are going to go through that evolution. We're going to talk about Sheol. We're going to talk about a bodily resurrection, the introduction of judgment, the resurrection of the soul, or eternal living of the soul, the concept of hell and its influences. We'll look at some subsets like universalism or annihilationism, and hopefully clearly show you why this people group, as it evolved in different places, in different cultures, in different situations, in different eras, added to, edited, changed, manipulated, retroactively refit, and evolved their afterlife belief system. So let's get started with the oldest idea from anything in this religion, which is the ancient Israelite idea of Sheol, a neutral underworld of the dead. It's a shadowy, somewhat mysterious existence where all people, regardless of their moral status before this God, will go. So this is unlike later Christian and even later Jewish ideas that still separate the dead into groups based off good or bad, forgiven or not. Sheol was indiscriminate. It was not a place of torture, nor was it a place of perfect pleasure or reward. It was just the realm of the dead. Maybe it was a place of passive existence. Maybe it was just the grave. Maybe it was no existence at all. I'm going to read you some different verses here, and you can get your own different ideas about it just from how you interpret it. So again, even our very first concept is up for debate. Sheol was very akin to the ancient Mesopotamian netherworld, Irkalla, where all souls resided in this dark and dusty domain without judgment. Let's go through some verses, starting right away, Genesis 37:35. All his sons and his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Jacob, believing that his son Joseph is dead, prepares to go down to him in Sheol. So we get the verbiage of death. And even though he says to be with him, it doesn't mean it's going to be an experience. He's just joining him where he is. This is Jacob. This is the birth of the nation of Israel, one of the top patriarchs. And this is his understanding, his assurance, what he knows to be true of what happens after death. Even your most righteous patriarchs expect to go down to Sheol. We have a lot of rethinking to do about our concept of heaven. Job 3:11-19. Why did I not perish at birth? For now I would be lying down in peace. The wicked cease from turmoil, and the weary are at rest. Prisoners are also at ease. The small and great are there, and the slave is freed from his master. Now we move on to our second great man of the Old Testament, also a very early figure, and he too believes in Sheol. When he's been tortured, he says at least he would be at peace, which is, again, how many atheists kind of conceive of non-existence. Not that you are there to experience peace, but you're not there at all. There is no experience, and therefore there's at least suffering. We also see there's no distinction between man. All are going here. This is a contradiction to the heaven and hell system. Ecclesiastes 9:10. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, to which you are going. This is the wisest man of all time, if you go with the biblical authorship here, Solomon, who believes that there's nothing, there's no consciousness when this all ends. And Job chirps back in Job 14:10-14, but a man dies and is laid low. Man breathes his last, and where is he? As water falls from the lake and river wastes away and dries up, so a man lies down and rises not again. Till the heavens are no more, he will not awake or be roused out of his sleep. Oh, that you would hide me in Sheol, that you would conceal me, that you would appoint me a set time and remember me. This is Job asking for that afterlife that Christians believe in, but admitting that it is not so. This is the finality of Sheol. Psalm 6:5, the earlier part of the Psalms are thought to be attributed to David, for in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise? This is it. This earth, this time here, this is all we've got. David, Solomon, Job, and Jacob, they all understood this to be the case. Now, the Israelites did not develop their belief about the afterlife in isolation. They were, of course, like everything, heavily influenced by their neighbors, their culture, their time, their surroundings. And at this time, in the ancient Near East cultures, like the Mesopotamians, like the Canaanites, again, we mentioned Irkalla, the Mesopotamian netherworld. Similar to Sheol, this is a neutral underworld. It's where the dead went, whether you were good or you were evil. They were in a weakened state, to say the least. They could not interact with the living, and there were gods that ruled over it, but there was no judgment. And then you had the Canaanite underworld, Mot's domain, where the god Mot ruled over the dead in a land where no one came back from. No concept of resurrection nor afterlife rewards. So the early Israelites, coming out of Mesopotamian and Canaanite cultures, naturally inherited this passive and neutral realm of the dead. And it wouldn't be until they got Greek and Roman and Persian where their views start to change. And there's plenty of excuses, and I'm not going to go through all of the objections and excuses because we still have a lot of evolution of afterlife to get through. But quickly, some Christians will claim that Sheol was the original plan, but there's a part 2, that this is just where everyone goes to sleep until Jesus resurrects them. But many of the verses I just read for you would defeat that. They do talk about the finality. There is no idea of a part 2. That concept does not exist. It was added in after the fact to excuse the evolved part of the religion. That's just very clear. Some will even argue that Sheol had its own 2 counterparts. We see this in Luke 16:22 through 23, where it talks about Abraham's bosom for the righteous. Although we don't really have a negative one quite mapped out in the New Testament referring to Sheol, because it's been moved to hell or Gehenna or Tartarus, which we'll get to. They'll bring in verses like 1 Peter 3:19, where Jesus goes to minister to the dead. But again, this is a New Testament belief that is trying to map back onto the Old, and it's trying to make sense out of it. Well, there's resurrection and new life in Jesus, and Jesus has been crucified and risen again for the people here. What about all the people that died in the flood? And that's what that verse actually references. Jesus will go down and minister to them, and they'll have their judgment. But that's a direct contradiction to the idea that everyone is just asleep. Did Jesus first wake them up to minister to them, then just to judge them? And again, we get all these New Testament exclusive with one another. Simply put, nowhere in the Old Testament does it suggest a 2-part Sheol, not once. The idea was imposed retroactively to try to harmonize what otherwise is not harmonized. So let's move into Second Temple Judaism, the post-exilic period. This is during or after the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE, and then that Second Temple period goes all the way to 70 CE with the destruction of that temple. So a pretty long runway to start making our move from death is final, no difference for the righteous or the wicked, to resurrection and judgment. Whatever could have happened during this time that made for such a change, that captivity being around the Babylonians and the Persians. The belief in a bodily resurrection is insane when compared with what was just covered about the view of Sheol. And final judgment, distinct fates, we are really turning things over. So first you have the influence of foreign powers. Persian and Hellenistic, that's where we get resurrection and cosmic judgment. Then you need to start introducing the problem of evil. These people, God's people who were supposedly protected and chosen, they've been in captivity, they've been enslaved, they've been oppressed. How do you account for this? How do you, more importantly, make up for this? Revenge, justice for themselves, judgment on their enemies, a place, a real place, a spiritual place of perfection, since it can't happen here on earth. We have motive now mixed with influence. Then you get into the Maccabean revolt, the idea of martyrdom, and you need compensation, you need reward. You need to know that your death in this movement is going to be seen, noticed, rewarded, and compensated. And then we see the Jewish thought clearly getting into this eschatological position.
Oh, digger!
Resurrection plays a major role. Let me give you some verses here to back this up. So Isaiah 26:19, this is the very first hints of resurrection. Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise.
I just got myself a whore.
Dust, awake and sing for joy.
Stupid!
This post-exilic context where Israel is struggling to rebuild after the captivity in Babylon. It's this almost propaganda for the national pride of Israel to be restored, that the individual who makes up Israel can also be restored in death. Again, clearly contradicting with the earlier views of Job and Jacob, where the dead cannot return to life. So that verse Isaiah is our first explicit idea of bodily resurrection. It's going to be Daniel, which many are now thinking is written much later, which continues to make sense. And that's Daniel 12:2. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. This sounds pretty clear to me, like an eternal reward or punishment system. Everlasting contempt. And also, many of those sleep. So again, it's this meeting in the middle. Okay, Sheol existed. We see this in Isaiah as well. They're asleep, but something's going to happen. We're starting to get different ideas about what's going to happen. But why just many? Why not all? Don't all who die either go to heaven or hell or annihilation or salvation? To say many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake means that some don't. This is another theological issue for the afterlife concept. Now, also, I typically try not to quote from apocryphal sources because we like to stay in the Protestant 66 case, because so many Christians who believe in just the Protestant Protestant canon will immediately reject anything outside of that anyways. But when you think about this time frame, the apocryphal writings, that's when they're happening. And so it makes sense to see what these Jewish people believed. And we can look at a few things. 2 Maccabees 7:9-14. You accursed wretch, you dismiss us from this present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life, because we have died for his laws. So we have resurrection and righteous judgment. In the Wisdom of Solomon 3:1-8, we get the souls of the righteous are in the judgment. Many are now thinking it is written much later, which continues to make sense. And that's Daniel 12:2. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. This sounds pretty clear to me like an eternal reward or punishment system. Everlasting contempt. And also, many of those who sleep. So again, it's this meeting in the middle. Okay, Sheol existed. We see this in Isaiah as well. They're asleep, but something's going to happen. And we're starting to get different ideas about what's going to happen. But also, why just many? Why not all? Don't all who die either go to heaven or hell or annihilation or universal salvation? To say many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake means that some don't. This is another theological issue for the afterlife concept. Now, also, I typically try not to quote from apocryphal sources because we like to just stay in the Protestant 66 maker case, because so many Christians who believe in just the Protestant canon will immediately reject anything outside of that anyways. But when you think about this time frame, the apocryphal writings, that's when they're happening. And so it makes sense to see what these Jewish people believed. And we can look at a few things. 2 Maccabees 7:9-14. You accursed wretch, you dismiss us from this present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life, because we have died for his laws. So we have resurrection and righteous judgment. In the Wisdom of Solomon 3:1-8, we get the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and no torment will ever touch them. In the eyes of the foolish they seem to have died, but they are at peace. So again, not 8. We get the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and no torment will ever touch them. In the eyes of the foolish they seem to have died, but they are at peace. So again, not quite clear. We know there's not going to be punished, but we also know they're going to be with God. So we have a lot of things happening here. Again, you can almost feel the ironing out of ideas and the ways to try to reconcile them still with the obvious Jewish thought that came before. That's why we have to keep referencing that something's happening to those that were asleep or driving it forward. We're evolving. So again, to understand a few of these influences, one would be the Persian influence. After the Babylonian exile, the Israelite people came under Persia. The main religion of the Persians at this time, Zoroastrianism, contained clear belief
I beg you, please fuck up and bring this war right here.
And reward or punishment. No one else thinks that it is just too coincidental that this group of people, at the same time they are being ruled by this new group of people who have ideas from their past that look like the others in that past culture, time, and place, like the Mesopotamians and the Canaanites, and start adopting something new that looks identical to their captors. It doesn't take a genius. I think it's all too clear. So, the Persian influence. Next, again, the Maccabean revolt. This happened between 167 and 160 BCE, and now we have a need for justice. The Greek king here is persecuting the Jews. They have desecrated the temple and forced them to essentially abandon the religion, the faith. Many Jews at this time are tortured and executed for not following Greek rule. And so very quickly, even though they should have been thinking about this for all their enemies the whole time in their history, they start to have to grapple with, wait a second, what is this all for? We're not ruling here anymore like we were. What happened to the Promised Land? Things aren't easy. Where's the milk and honey? Where's the prosperity? Where's us being the leaders of our world? Did we lose? We can't lose. Oh, there must be something coming next. There must be a bigger reward. Something we were thinking so small, so human. The real world is the next world. And we will be rewarded there, and our enemies crushed. It's a cope. Which, by the way, all afterlife systems are essentially a cope. a God of the gaps for the unknown that we're so uncomfortable with. What happens when we die? Why were we here at all? What was our meaning when we were here? What happens when it's over? Will we be rewarded if we suffer here? Will we be compensated? And will those who made us suffer get theirs too? It's what all of it's answering, just in different ways and at different times. And thankfully, the Israelites, the Jewish people, help us get through quite a few of them. Then you get the Hellenistic influence is probably the third thing here with what is causing the change. This is the concept of the immortal soul. Under this Greek rule, many Jews were exposed to this philosophical concept, this Platonic philosophy, the immortality of the soul rather than just a bodily resurrection, which is what we have been previously talking about. I want to make sure I made that distinction. The Greeks say the soul is naturally immortal and goes to a realm of bliss or punishment based off its encounters here on earth. This is not the idea before their influence, it becomes the idea after their influence. And by the way, it's not like us thousands of years later said, wait a second, this doesn't all work together. This is why you even had the division in the first place between, say, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees believed in resurrection. The Sadducees didn't. They rejected that. We see that in both Mark and Acts. But they had good reason to. They were just reading a different part of the Bible without making the excuses. I think we can oftentimes, we're told this from apologetics, that things were so easy that Christianity looked one way for a long time until those Protestants screwed it up, till that Reformation brought in all these new ideas and attention. And that's not true. There has been disagreement and infighting and splits all the way through. But just like now, everyone thought they were right. They were the one exception. They had it correct. They heard from God. They had their revelation. They had their patriarch. They had their verse. An all-you-can-eat buffet, a design your own afterlife. So, we have all of our big building blocks now. But it's time to start defining things. Moving into the Hellenistic period itself and the time with Jesus, let's really nail down these thoughts on eternal punishment. It did not exist in early Jewish thought, that's clear. And this development of hell took literal centuries to happen. And it was shaped by a mix of internal theological evolution, foreign cultural influences, and the political climate of the time. So where did the idea of hell come from? This fiery, tormenting, and eternal hell of Christianity. This could be its own 15-hour video. People have written books about this concept. I'm going to give you just a few things. Let's start with four main influences that helped develop this idea. Again, still the Persian influence, the Zoroastrianism. That introduces an idea of final judgment and division between eternal reward or punishment. Then you get the Greek thought, who had Hades and Tartarus, two terms we see used in the New Testament. This added the notion of consciousness to this afterlife torment, where the soul itself suffers based off the morality of the individual. But then we also have the Jewish people doing their own thing. They are now under their own mix of influences, creating this apocalypticism. It's a hard word to say. Here, hell didn't just help us understand what happened to us as a fear tactic. It gave us a sense of relief of what would happen to our enemies because of what they did. It becomes a divine justice system. And then you get Jesus and early Christianity as our fourth one, where Gehenna and Hades and the lake of fire are accepted. This is the new punishment imagery, shifting towards again a moralized afterlife. And I'll give you some examples again. Going back to Isaiah, where we're getting the first glimpses of some of these changes. This is where we get a fiery fate entering the picture. Isaiah 66:24. Their worm shall not die. Their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. Now, this passage is actually describing corpses being burned outside of Jerusalem, not conscious souls being tormented. But in Mark 9:48, Jesus refers to this verse to illustrate and give example of the hell he is speaking about. Then you have Gehenna, which is Greek for the Valley of Hinnom, and originally was a real place outside of Jerusalem. If you go back to the Old Testament in 2 Kings, this is the place where those who worshipped Moloch would do child sacrifices. But in Jesus' time, it was kind of the town trash dump where you would burn what you didn't need. And the imagery became a metaphor for divine justice. This is where many people disagree, especially if you're talking to someone who believes in annihilationism or universal salvation. They'll say, you don't understand.
I didn't hear you.
This real everlasting conscious torment place. Jesus was just talking about how the bad things would be burned up. The end would be. You can apply this to anything. The fact that there will be a new heaven and earth, and therefore all the old will go away. Or a purification. Some people will bring this into limbo or purgatory. Some people will talk about a short stint of hell where you're purified before universal salvation. Others will say you haven't been purified before you were annihilated. And others will say, no, this is imagery, it is metaphorical, but it is about an eternal conscious torment. If only there was a promised Holy Spirit who would give wisdom whenever it was asked for and would lead people in truth and in spirit and in power, it would probably clear all this up, and yet we don't have it. You can pull 1,000 different Christians on the afterlife and get almost as many different ideas.
Now fuck the verses here.
Matthew 5:22. Whoever says, you fool, be liable to the hell of fire. The Greek word being used there, Gehenna. So Jesus is using it to symbolize divine punishment. But that's not in the Old Testament. Matthew 10:28. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. We'll talk about this verse again later during Annihilation, but here Jesus is linking it to destruction, not eternal torment. In Mark 9:47-48, it is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than to have two eyes and be thrown into hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Now again, this is Jesus quoting back to Isaiah, and incorrectly, unless it's just a huge leap in metaphor, because we know what it was trying to be alluded to in Isaiah. But here we have two insights into non-death, non-destruction. The worm does not die, and the fire is not quenched. Okay, but maybe humans do. Maybe it's just a place filled with worms and fire. Don't know, unclear. But Gehenna is not always the word used. Sometimes it's Hades. Like in Luke 16:19-31, this is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. A rich man suffers in Hades, while a poor man, Lazarus, is in Abraham's bosom. Again, trying to retroactively make Sheol, the place where you're asleep with your fathers, into some at least positive reward system. But also showing that there's a negative one, and that someone is there, and they're there for a while, and they're actively suffering. Hades, by the way, being a Greek concept, originally from Homer's Odyssey, where souls existed after death in a ghostly state. Interesting enough, in the Greek Septuagint, translation of the Old Testament, Hades replaces the word Sheol. Again, showing that major Greek influence on Jewish thought. You can see the evolution in the words that are used in translation. In Revelation 20:14, then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire, meaning Hades itself can be destroyed. And that contradicts the idea of eternal hell. So if Hades is temporary, then why do modern Christians even teach about hell? And then there's also the lake of fire. This is a lot of things that get
that means Hades itself.
And again, some people will claim, oh no, we have an understanding for it on both sides. Right? They'll read a book by Bart Ehrman and they'll be like, no, I totally understand. I know exactly what it means. I know exactly what the afterlife is, while still maintaining their belief in Jesus and his resurrection and salvation. While someone else who doesn't believe in God at all can still read the Bible and come away with an idea about universalism under that doctrine, or even the concept of conscious eternal torment. You really can't get all ideas out of the Bible. You can argue about them. You can say, well, you know yours is right, but you can't deny that many Christians throughout much of history have believed mutually exclusive things about what happens when they die. That's a problem. It's one of the things I'm trying to point out here. For the lake of fire, we have the devil who had deceived them, was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophets were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Problem is, a lot of people are called false prophets under a lot of different conditions throughout the Old and New Testament. And then you can even make a case that all the people who ever claimed to believe and then didn't, because their works didn't match up, or again, all the different ways you take it are actually false prophets. And then you can say all non-believers are technically false prophets. You can get into this whole, okay, even though it's classification for who gets eternal conscious torment, we can broaden that categorization to include the people we don't like, or the people we're trying to convert, or whatever the case may be. I'm not here to tell you what I think is doctrinally accurate. I don't even know if there is such a thing. This is not univocal by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just here to show all the different iterances of it. Because again, I think it'll help you see how man-made it all is. Revelation 21:8, but the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and the liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. Now, second death implies annihilation, but a burning lake of sulfur sure sounds like a burning lake of fire that was just referenced, where there is eternal conscious torment. Again, you can make both cases off of this verse here. So hell is changing one way or another, and it's because of the Greek influence mainly. Hades, Tartarus, immortal souls, all of these things. You still have the Zoroastrian element of fiery final justice. You still have the Roman oppression that leads to the Jewish apocalypticism. We see that, for instance, with another apocryphal work like the Book of Enoch that describes fire and demons in hell. And also Christian theology actually needed a moral system. Post-mortem justice became necessary. And so the New Testament heaven and hell framework evolved. The wicked needed punished, and the righteous needed reward. And in whatever form you accept it, all of that is different than the original concept of Sheol. You cannot tell me there's not an evolution to the afterlife concept in the biblical text. There is. And then quickly here you have the rise of both annihilationism and universalism, which I've already mentioned more on the way through than I thought I was going to. So quickly, let's cover this. Annihilationism is the concept that the wicked are ultimately destroyed, that they are not eternally tormented. Even this camp is broken in two, with if they're destroyed immediately upon death, or if they still need to go through some refinement or punishment system before they can be annihilated. Universalism is probably the simplest of all of these options, and it's just the belief that everyone goes to heaven. But again, do they go to heaven right away when they die? Do they go to heaven after the final judgment? What's the point of the final judgment if everyone goes to heaven? Oh, because maybe even under universalism you have to be refined or purified first before you can go. Again, these people cannot agree on what they believe even under this alternate explanation. Do you see how messy and ridiculous all of this is yet? But where do we get these ideas? Quickly, I'll read to you some verses. Again, going back to Matthew 10:28, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul, rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Okay. God is going to be able to destroy both the body and the soul. The two things that at different times have both thought to not be eternal in any way, or to not be rewarded in any way. But here both can be destroyed. And in the next one, both can be accepted. Or at least one, the soul. There's still some question even amongst people that straight up believe in heaven, which is one part of this we haven't even really talked about yet, with if it is a new body, which is described in the Bible, or if you just exist kind of in soul form. It says there will be recognition, but to what degree? Then we get into all the problems with heaven, which I've talked about enough. Also, 2 Peter 2:6 gives an idea by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. Okay, so if extinction is the example, then extinction is the answer, and extinction sounds more like annihilationism than our typical concept of hell. Many will reach back into the Old Testament to Malachi 4:1-3, for behold, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and evildoers will be stubble. The day is coming that shall set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. Sounds like complete destruction. Also out of context a wee bit, and not compatible with the idea of eternal torment, nor the idea of Sheol. Psalm 37:20 says that the wicked will perish, the enemies of the Lord are like the glory of the pastures, they vanish like smoke, they vanish away. Again, it gets weird when you reach into the Old Testament to make your case for annihilation, because a lot of this just sounds like physical retribution for the people that go against God being burned up or destroyed, nothing to do with their afterbody or their soul. It's a good reinforcement for what they're trying to milk out of the New Testament already. Then Revelation 21:8, the second death, which sounds like a final death. Again, annihilation. So where do people get verses for universalism? And again, not that we can agree on what fashion universalism takes on, but Colossians 1:19-20 says, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. I mean, that's a pretty good verse to make you believe in universalism. The problem is that it is in direct contradiction with everything else we've covered. With Sheol, with hell, with annihilationism. You can't have any of that if you have this. 1 Corinthians 15:22 says, for as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. That sounds like resurrection for everybody. It doesn't necessarily guarantee a happy resurrection, but the connotation is with life, which is being opposed here to death. So there's that. In 1 Timothy 2:3-4, we get, "This is good, and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth." That's a really stretch of verse there. I love this verse in terms of making the case that this Bible, if this God were true, proves that he already lost. If he desires for all to be saved, if that's his will, and he's all-powerful, and even one person has been annihilated, or is in Sheol, or worse, is burning in hell, then this God did not get his will. And yet he's perfect. And he works for his will to be done. And he says he will answer prayers that are prayed for his will to be done. So there's just no excuse here for his purposeful deception, hardening of hearts, or the very fact that he would create hell or annihilation or anything like this. It just doesn't all work together. And funny, because this next verse is loved and used by all three main groups. And that is Philippians 2:10-11. At the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth, under the earth. Every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. The universalist will say, "See, everyone will come, everyone will know, and then everyone will believe. They'll go to heaven." The one who believes in annihilation will say, "Yep, the time will come, but if I add in my other verses, all this proves is that they confess before they're disposed of." And those who believe in hell will say, "Yep, look, final judgment comes, and even those who didn't believe, you're going to have to face Jesus. You're going to have that moment before he sends you to hell where you are forced to acknowledge that you were wrong." They put it in my comments often. I assure you, people who believe in hell use this verse. They love painting pictures for this moment for me because they want me to get mine. They want me to have that moment where I'm wrong and I know it. What love, what peace, what justice. And by the way, each of these developed for their own obvious reasons. Some people couldn't reconcile the idea of Sheol with heaven and hell, so creating annihilationism matches up pretty well. Some people couldn't reconcile or justify endless punishment, eternal conscious torment. And so annihilation fits well for that. Or universalism. Because if there really is a good God who desires all should be with him, then all need to be with him. So we'll just say they are. We could go on about the lake of fire, and we could go on about the new heaven and the new earth. But I do think you get the point I'm trying to make in this video, and I feel like I've already gone on pretty long. So let's do a quick wrap up here, kind of a closeout. To me, with everything I've listed, and so much that I didn't, it is clear to me that there is an unmistakable evolution of the afterlife concept throughout even just the Protestant canon, let alone the other books. Sheol is the original Hebrew view. The Persian influence gives us resurrection and judgment. The Hellenistic influence gives us Gehenna and Hades and the immortal soul. Christian hell then comes along and cannot be agreed upon. It exists in different fashions with different groups going to different places based off different things, but also different definitions about who is contained within those groups. And we get arguments about the lake of fire versus purgatory versus being annihilated versus maybe everyone being saved. So why would an omniscient God change his mind on the idea of the afterlife? How was this not put forward from the beginning? God decides to make man in his own image with the foreknowledge that it would go wrong, that the first man ever created and the first woman ever created would both sin almost as soon as they possibly could, and that he would choose to curse everybody else that ever exists with the same punishment, death. But what happens after you die? Did God not think it through? Did God have a different plan for some people than others? We hear this context thing all the time, that, law back then for the Jewish people was different than law for us today. New covenant, things of that nature. Is it not the same? Maybe Sheol is just for the ancient Jews. Except some of those verses talk about all men, what everyone will face. Well, all must just not mean all, or well, it does until Jesus comes. But then Jesus is going to change things, and we're kind of back on with the new covenant cliche. We're talking about, again, a foundational element and principle of religion, though. It changing makes no sense at all. It being dependent makes no sense at all. And even if you could draw Sheol into some new theology that is different just for people after Jesus, which is hell, universalism, or being annihilated. And then if you can agree, which you cannot, on which of those three, agree on what those three look like. What is hell? How do you go there? Who keeps you there? How long is it? Is it physical? or is it mental? Do we have a body or just a soul? How do you torture a soul? If it's annihilation, do you go there right away? After judgment? After being purified? What's the point of purifying you before he annihilates you? If it's universalism, is it really universalism? Is it really like some still be asleep? Like referenced in one of our first verses. Do some have to be burned and defined first? For how long? Who determines that? Who's judging it? Where is it? Where are you taking to? Where is this heaven? All the problems with heaven. And again, if it's really hell, is it metaphorically hell? And again, you could just go on and on. I'm going to end just by asking questions. Here's some questions I want you to think about. Why does God remain completely silent in the entire Torah about the concept of heaven and hell, which would dominate the New Testament? Why did God allow the idea of fear to be the prominent and only idea for over 1,000 years about the afterlife? Why did God allow other cultures who worship false and fake gods to influence the afterlife system that would be claimed to him in the future of this religion? Why does Jesus himself define and describe hell in contradicting terms? And if you tell me that he didn't, he was clear on it, then why do most Christians disagree on the concept of hell? That's really it for today. Thank you again, Becca, for the suggestion. I hope that everyone who is a free thinker or higher will raise their hand for the March video. I'll be excited to see what every one of you has in store. I'll see you Tuesday with another takedown, and until then, keep. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Alexander, Ann, Boris, Eric, GBI, Joe, Boga, Matt, Terry, and Sean, my Humanist Heroes, James, Jared, Christy, and Throna, my Atheist Advocates, Caleb, David, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Julie, Malcolm, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas, as well as all of If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining this fine group.
From China!